what I want to do to start off with today is just have a bit of get a bit of a feel for where our world is at. And I want to ask you a bit of a question today. This first one here, so there are roughly 7 billion people in the world today, and I want to ask you which map shows where people live. So I want you to type in the chat either A, B, or C. I'm not going to judge on any comments at all. Just give me a feel for what you think. Where do most people live in our world today? A, B, or C? Type in the chat and hit enter. A, you can either have it to me privately or you can just send it out to everyone, that's fine. Let's get a few more answers up. Mostly A, a B, there's a C in there. We've definitely got mostly A's. Excellent. All right, so we know that most people in the world are living in A, which I guess is a lot of where our callers are coming in from today, or where you're listening from today. And that's an extremely rapidly growing part of our world. Let's have a think about this particular question though. Worldwide, 30-year-old men have spent 10 years in school on average. How many years have women of the same age spent in school? So what do we think about this one? So these are global statistics that come from the UN databases. C, so this is just globally. How many years on average do we think women at 30, by the time we're 30, have spent at school? A couple of A's, B's, a couple of C's. Type away. Let's see what we think it is. 6 years on average, so women have spent at school. And it's interesting that a couple of you chose C, or even the B's and A's. Where do we get our thoughts from? Where do we get our answers from? How do we know how many years women have been at school? It's really quite interesting to think about, where do we know these facts about the world from? How do we know this information? And a lot of it comes from social media, a lot of it comes from the news, and a lot of it's fairly negative, right? So when we think about these things, obviously, we have a long way to go in terms of women in school, but it's not necessarily 3 years that we may think. What do we think of this one? How many of the world's 1-year-old children today have been vaccinated against some disease? What do we think that one is? A, B, or C on that one? C, B, B's, a couple of C's. So this is a big issue, right? Helps us with pertinent to disease. Yeah, let's have a look at what our answer is. Thanks for putting up those answers actually, and engaging in this conversation. So A is our answer there. So a lot of you are right on target with your answers. So we've got 80% of the world's 1-year-old children have been vaccinated against some disease. And a lot of times we think it's a lot lower that, given that what we're seeing in the news. And I wanted to kickstart the conversation or our class today with this information, because a lot of the work around girls in schools, vaccination, work on malaria, AIDS, those type of diseases and health-related issues all stemmed from work around the period of 2000 to 2015. So this is when the United Nations worked with governments on the Millennium Development Goals. I don't know if you guys may have heard of those. You might have been too young, but the Millennium Development Goals did a lot of work around health. When it got to the year 2015, the United Nations introduced Agenda 2030. So on the 25th of September 2015, 193 member states came together and signed Agenda 2030. And Agenda 2030 is an agenda that comprises of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These goals are all around people, planet, and prosperity through partnership and peace. Now, having a look at these Sustainable Development Goals, I just put in the chat area for me if you guys have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. Obviously, you're interested in them. You're coming onto this class to have a bit of a listen today. Can you give me a feel for where you may have heard of them? Maybe it's was it high school? Maybe it's currently where you're studying. Maybe it's at home. They're quite a hot, rolling out at work. Excellent. So yeah, they're definitely a hot topic today, and definitely really important that we're covering them in schools and definitely being rolled out in high schools and as part of universities and as part of our curriculum. So these are our beautiful Sustainable Development Goals. Now these underlyingly represent the biggest challenges that we face as a world. And there's some pretty big challenges in here. And I think it's just if we take a few seconds just to look at them and comprise of of no poverty. And a lot of people say to me, how are we expected to achieve no poverty by 2030? We have 10 years left. And I think it's really important when we're looking at these goals that we are not to look at them as individual global goals. They are very holistic in nature. So the Sustainable Development Goals are a framework. And this framework allows us to have a holistic discussion or put a holistic lens over the discussions and the decisions that we are making. Really important as we move on in this discussion that we understand the goals are not an answer. They present us with a framework to have the bigger conversation that we need to have. Unlike the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals explicitly call on all sectors to apply creativity and innovation to addressing the challenges that these goals present. The Millennium Development Goals very much were driven by governments and drilled down into local government work and very much at a federal and international level. The SDGs are different in that the United Nations is asking all sectors, and the sector that's particularly differentiated with this is the private sector. So we have corporates coming on board now, we have our not-for-profits, we have our communities, our societies, we have academia, and we have our governments all looking at what challenges our world is facing through this particular framework. And I think that's a real differentiator, and you'll find as I move through this presentation, I'll talk a bit more about the private sector, but it's extremely important that the private sector are coming into this conversation and thinking about their impact on our environment and their responsibility to our communities and our society, and intertwining that discussion with the economy and joining partnerships with different areas. So that's the big difference between the Millennium Development Goals and the SDGs. And as I mentioned, they're the goals that we are particularly focused on up until the year of 2030. You're interested in researching further, so hopefully this class today will give you, just an insight into the Sustainable Development Goals and what they may mean for your discipline and the desire, I guess, to want to learn a bit more about them when you're off this call, whether that be in your study or in the workplace. So underlyingly, under the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there are 169 targets, and there are over 232 indicators or measures on how we are achieving these goals. So every country is measured annually, and we'll have a look at a bit of those results in a minute. But each country is also asked to produce 2 voluntary national review reports between the period of 2015 and then 2030. Australia submitted their first in 2018. It would be really interesting for you to have a look at your country and if your country has submitted its voluntary national review report and what's it saying, what's your country's commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals. How are they being chatted about at a government level or for the organisation that you work for? How is the organisation that you work for committed to realising the Sustainable Development Goals? So I'm not going to go into too much in depth about the targets and the indicators. Each of them differ among the goals. So, for example, no poverty has about 5 targets that it wants to achieve, and there's all different targets relevant. And companies and governments are looking at the goals and the targets and seeing how they can align what they do with those goals and targets. They're also looking at the indicators, but also then looking at, we'll see, that's how the UN measure my achievement in this area. How can I as an organisation or I as a government or I in a household, what does that target mean to me? How can I have impact in this space? So I wanted to put the Sustainable Development Goals up today. I just wanted to expand the goal number and its title in a larger form for you, because I just want you to take a couple of minutes and just have a look at it. There isn't a single thing we don't do every day that doesn't fit under one of these goals. Everything we do, we could fit under one of them. So it's interesting because another question I get all the time is, how do I focus on all of them? And companies are asking, and governments are asking those questions as well. What we want to do as organisations is look at the ones that we can align with. So I may say, as an organisation, I'm doing this under gender equality. And I'm having impact in this space, and this is how I'm measuring it. I'm doing this as far as climate action is concerned. These are my targets. This is how I'm measuring it. But then I also want to know what I'm not doing. So what is really interesting is, which do you think the goal that is least focused on by all sectors? I think that's a really interesting thought, one that we tend to, not necessarily, not that we don't think a lot about it, but again, sometimes it can get a bit confusing as to whose responsibility it is. Definitely reduced inequalities is a big one. The one that we least report on actually is SDG 14, is life below water, which is really interesting for for East Asia and the Pacific especially, given we are surrounded by so much water. And I always kind of wonder why that is. I think life below water is whose responsibility is the water? And we could say it's everyone's responsibility. And so therefore, how do we put actions and measures around that? So I think that's really important discussions to have, and why I love a Sustainable Development Goal discussion, and you can see that I'm very passionate about them, is because it does put front and centre all these areas that sometimes we forget a lot about. I really like how they've separated reduced inequalities and gender inequality, and that we can have a discussion about both. It's extremely important. So great that you've had a thought about which ones you're aligned with and which one do you feel is most important. What I also really like about that conversation, and what I think is really interesting, is that, and it just shows how we are as humans, we're all different and we all have different priorities. And I think, that's a really good question at the moment is how is our current environment, how is the pandemic, going to affect some of these. So a lot of organisations are moving through this pandemic, and we talk about them putting a COVID lens on their operations. How does COVID-19 affect their operations? But they're also putting an SDG lens on their operations and saying, as we come out of this pandemic, we can't come out of it the way that we went in. And we have to think very differently about our impact on the environment and our responsibility to our society and the community. And a lot of institutions are using the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework to help them do that, to help them ask those questions. Yeah, let's keep going. I just want to give you a feel for, this is a state of play, and I'm sorry that these are quite tiny, but you can look this up. This is the Sustainable Development Goal Index. These are the 2019 reports. So the index is produced by the Sustainable Development Solution Network in alignment with the UN. And the 2020 results are not out yet. They had a bit of a change in their methodology and some of their indices that they were measuring, but this is a 2019 result. And not sure if you can find your country there. I boxed Australia for you, but I wasn't too sure what other countries we might have online today. If you pop it up in the chat area, we can have a look for you. But basically what this index does, and so I think we've got India sits at about 115 in the ranking, so there's about 193 member countries. What is really interesting to give you a feel, and you can go back and have a look at the previous reports, Australia started in 2016, we were at about 16th spot, and we've really gone down over the past couple of years, and a lot of that has to do with climate action and different decisions that feed down at those particular levels. But the index gives you a feel for where countries are at, and the report then actually takes you into the dashboards for each country. And I've just brought up a couple of countries here just to give us a bit of a chat around the dashboard. So this first, this is the Australia dashboard for 2019, and this dashboard tells me that Australia is at critical levels of not achieving the goals around zero hunger. We are at critical levels for Sustainable Development Goal 7. We are at for 12 and 13. And I think this is the dashboard, sorry, the second one here is the dashboard for India. And this bottom one here is the dashboard for the Central Republic of Africa. And what I wanted to show with these three areas is just how much red is actually on all of them. I think if I go back to that index, and I don't know if I can go back up the slide, our top country here is Denmark and Sweden and Finland. And so they've got a lot more green than what's happening in our part of the world as far as the dashboard is concerned. But for example, just to give you an idea, Australia has the worst material consumption rate of all OECD countries. We know we have the highest energy prices. We know we really at a federal level don't have a climate action plan necessarily. And so these are some of our critical areas, that our country is facing. Let's have a look, if we have a look at the India dashboard, and it'd be really interesting if you agree or disagree to get your thoughts in the chat there. India, some of your biggest challenges are around water, so clean water and sanitation is one of those extreme challenges that you're focusing on as a country. And if we have a look at Africa, very much around Africa, underlyingly a lot of their challenges sit around conflict, and that stops a lot of their progression. So these dashboards, while we don't particularly like to compare countries, I really just wanted to put them up because a lot of the times, we look at different countries and we think, oh, well, that country is not necessarily hungry. Or, for example, you might say, well, Australia is not necessarily a hungry, country, but we have, hunger is all about being able to source healthy and sustainable food. It's about obesity rates. it's about a lot of underlyingly under that goal. If you have a look at the targets and what they're measuring, gives you a better understanding of where particular countries are sitting. Thank you for that question. Grey. So the grey represents that we don't have enough data on that particular target or goal, which is really interesting for Africa, isn't it? So they just don't track anything really to do with the water. I didn't put the dashboard up here, but an interesting one is for Oceania. So for a lot of the countries, the smaller countries that are around the Australian border, there's a lot of grey in there, and we're just not collecting the data, and these are some of our closest countries and closest partners. I urge you to have a look further into this dashboard and to ask yourself, whatever area I'm studying, which goal can I have an effect on? Which area of work that I do, which goals affects it, and what does this mean? What is the work that I do? How can I help my country? Red is that you're at critical levels for not meeting that goal. Obviously, green is you're on track of meeting that goal. And then we have our shades of amber and yellow. So this one's heading towards red. Lots and lots of work to be done in this particular space. And I think it's really interesting if we look at this dashboard to look at it holistically. We tend to just have a discussion about climate action on its own, but we can't. We have to look at it within, this multitude of other things that are happening on our planet. Okay. I think it's really interesting when we're looking at our challenges and we think about moving ahead, what do we think are I'm just going to ask you for the 5 risks that will have the biggest impact on our world over the next 10 years. And I wanted to show you this particular chart that they put in their report for 2020. So this is their 2020 Global Risk Report. And if I've analysed these reports, over the past 20 years or so, and for the first time this year, they've shown the risks in this interconnected type of networking diagram. For the first time in a long time, the top risks are on the size of the risk here is the size of this diamond shape here. The top risks that we face are climate action failure, extreme weather, water, human-made environmental disasters, and biodiversity loss. For the first time in 20 years, our top 5 risks are environment related. But why they produced this particular diagram was, again, to show the interconnectedness of all these risks. So up here, you'll see a lot of the ones that you talked about. We've got unemployment here. We've got our water. We've got migration. We've got social instability. And what this diagram shows us, we've got infectious diseases. We've got food. And what's really interesting, if we have a look at these ones, that are sitting in the middle, and as they feed out, just how interconnected they are to everything else. So, and I think this is really important moving forward, and especially important, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think it's really important as we move out of this pandemic, those actions that we take. I think it's interesting, again, a lot of you mentioned climate change. The actual wording is, we tend to use the wording climate action failure. I mean, climate change is pretty much a given. We know we're in it. Our biggest risk moving forward is failure to take action. And I think it's interesting, it sits in the middle here because it is so interconnected to everything that we do. And it's one of those crises that the coronavirus hit us quite unexpected, quite quickly. Climate action climate change is a slow creeper, and when it does hit, there's not a vaccine for this one. So we really, as we move out of this pandemic, we need to think more holistically and start to see these interconnections in the decisions that we're making. And that's really hard to do unless you have some type of framework, which is why the Sustainable Development Goals are so crucial to our discussions. So they do represent one of the largest and most sustained influences to date, and they provide us an opportunity to rethink our approaches to value creation, and a lot of businesses are using them that way. So why is this important for our graduates? And I wanted to spend just a couple of slides thinking about, why is this important for you guys to have a conversation about? Why is it important for you at this point in your lives to think about? And I want to put some little statements up here. We've got our most profitable, the 50 of the top most profitable companies, over 70% of them are including the Sustainable Development Goals in their annual reports. And over 50% of them have identified which Sustainable Development Goals they are aligned with, so which ones their companies are prioritising and which ones their companies are not prioritising. And what's really interesting for organisations is that that third point there, that those companies that are most visible on the Sustainable Development Goals, so those companies that are talking about them, are receiving a significant more amount of positive coverage in our business media, which is really quite interesting. So there's always a discussion around, companies are just signing up for these it's just because it's the flavour of the day, or they just want to look good in the sense of their consumers. Why they're signing up for them is a variety of reasons, but they are enabling them to have a more holistic discussion and to receive enormous amounts of savings when having these holistic discussions. To give you an example of some reasons of why they are also more important, when we're talking about climate resilience, and I think it's important that if we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and we're looking at the future direction of your careers and your study, I think the word resilience is an extremely important word. So the Financial Stability Board Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is now asking all companies to disclose how physical climate-related risks and the transition to a low-carbon economy may affect corporate performance. So we know that our big banks, we know our investments, we know our big lenders, and now asking the question of, if I'm investing in you, how does your product, how does your service, how does your business, how does your startup, how does this work? How are you impacted by climate changes in the future? It's a real discussion on the table. And when we think back to that interconnected diagram, when we're thinking about climate change, it has interwoven itself into so many other areas. So the discussion is becoming bigger and bigger. The second point there, we know the Department of Defence is asking operations worldwide to adapt their operations to address the impact of climate change. All industries, all businesses are thinking about our weather, natural disasters, our loss of biodiversity. How does that affect our business, and how are we going to be resilient against that? And that also then creates a discussion of opportunity. How can our business pivot, or what can we do to improve this situation? In regards to why is this important for our world, I wanted to put this up because it's quite a recent statistic, and I thought it was really quite interesting, especially for Australia. We come out of a summer that had horrendous bushfires, and then we've moved in, obviously, like all countries, the pandemic. So 40%, current statistic says that 40% of businesses do not reopen after a disaster. And another 25% will fail within 1 year of that. And I think that's an important statistic for us to think about when we're looking at how we do come out of this pandemic. and how we move and the decisions that we make for our cities and our communities, and how important it is to take that holistic lens on those decisions. I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are. I know a lot of you are calling in from India today, and India is an extremely innovative country, an extremely innovative culture. So you very much have a culture of, startups and founding businesses. Australia doesn't necessarily have that culture, so it'd be interesting to see how the two come out of this pandemic, and how especially our small to medium-sized businesses, and how we can have that more holistic discussion for them. And again, just asking us to have that holistic lens and to try and see those interconnections in our discussions, in our conversations, in our debates, in our actions. If we're in our engineering class, ask our engineering academic to allow us to have a debate or a discussion with another discipline on this topic. It's so crucial now that our health and medicine scientists are talking to our engineers, and then our engineers, are talking to our scientists, because the decision that they're making affects pollution, and pollution is affecting our health. So we're seeing that these interdisciplinary conversations are starting to happen, and we know that because there's publications occurring in this space. So we've got engineers now publishing with medical doctors. So we can see all these different disciplines or worlds coming together. It obviously needs to happen a lot faster, especially as we move out of this pandemic. And we need to use these Sustainable Development Goals, or this framework, to help us have that holistic lens, to start to see these discussions. So I know we have an Act for SDG Day at the University of Wollongong on the 25th of September, and we bring student teams together from all different schools around the university, and we can have a discussion around climate action. And a law student will see it very differently to a nurse, and a nurse will see it very differently to an engineer. An engineer is going to see it very differently to an economist. And just to see them sit around that table and have a discussion on what are our solutions for this, is extremely rich and has to happen more as we move forward. So in regards to who's talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, I thought this was obviously, there's different funding bodies that are starting to open up in regards to funding work that is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular mentions them. So we've got the Royals, who are joining up with David Attenborough, funding individuals or organisations every year around the Sustainable Development Goals. What's really interesting is that this is now, universities just used to be this place, of research, whereas now these funding bodies are going to businesses and individuals, and asking all sectors and all citizens for opportunities in this space. We've got who's talking about this. Obviously, the chairman for Tata in India. There's a number of organisations in India that align themselves with the Sustainable Development Goals. The World Economic Forum, the Strategic World Economic Forum partners, you can no longer be a Strategic World Economic Forum partner unless you sign up to the Sustainable Development Goals, and unless you can show how your organisation is aligning or having impact in the Sustainable Development Goals. So you've got some big major players throughout the world who are presenting this information and who are asking us to have this conversation. We obviously know a lot about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We've got the World Health Organization who's aligning themselves with the goals. We've also got the Times Higher Education impact rankings. They previously, before a couple of years ago, obviously are ranking systems around universities and research and publications. This impact rankings looks at how universities meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is quite a new impact rankings for universities. And yeah, so East Asia and Pacific universities, have done really well in the recent round of these rankings, and UOW did really well. So yeah, I'd urge you to have a look at those and look at where you're studying, and look at what is the impact that they're having on the world, and how important are the Sustainable Development Goals to them. Just getting closer to the end of the class, I also wanted to. We talk a lot about why we need to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, and we talk a lot about our challenges, and we do have many of them as a world. But a challenge also represents an opportunity. So one of the beautiful things about Sustainable Development Goals is we can look at our business, or we can look at our area or our discipline through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals and see many different opportunities. So for a startup is looking at how their value proposition aligns with particular Sustainable Development Goals, but also then looking at a goal that they didn't think they aligned with, and having to rewrite their value proposition and have a think about, how do we affect life below water? As an organisation, can we have impact in this space? I never thought we could. How could we? So they're creating lots of different opportunities for employees within organisations to come up with some really cool ideas. The UN are estimating there's about $12 trillion worth of new market opportunities if we looked at these goals and we looked at how our organisations, the opportunities that are presented within there. And also savings. We know that organisations, if they reduce their emissions, if they look at their water usage, if they look at their other resource consumption, there's just so much savings that could be made. This was a particular recent stat around Unilever. So they saw that obviously Unilever has many different products, but those brands taking action for people and planet grew 69% faster than the rest of our businesses last year. And why I wanted to raise that point is, and I'd be interested to hear about what's happening in your part of the world, but I know in my part of the world, during this pandemic, there's been a real shift, towards growing your own food, buying from local providers and local farmers, having a real think about our impact. And I think that will only increase moving forward. I hope it does. And so, yeah, I'm really putting this call out there to you guys to be the change makers that we need you to be. And I think this framework allows you to have that discussion. It allows you to put that lens and have a beautiful discussion with other disciplines that you may not have been able to have before. I really just wanted today to present these goals to you, or present this framework to you, and just, see where you want to take it. See what conversations you want to have, when you go home this evening. And they are crucial conversations, that we need to have. Whatever decision you're making, when you go to buy lunch today, have a think about, not that I think you're all at home at the moment anyway, but, if you're ordering online, have a look at that decision, start to practice it. Have a look at that decision through the Sustainable Development Goals. Use this framework. If you're, go back to your workplace if you're working or if you're studying, have a go at using this framework at home or in your organisations.